deep within the depths of human behavior lies something more profound than a simple lack of knowledge. It involves those unseen barriers that hold a person captive within their own delusions and weaknesses. The saddest part is that a truly misguided person often doesn't recognize their limitations, continuing to make the same mistakes as if following a pre-written script. Instead of learning from the past and taking responsibility for their actions, they tend to blame the outside world for their failures. As Carl Jung once noted, until a person becomes aware of their unconscious motives, those motives will control their life, determining their destiny. In other words, a person prone to foolishness wanders through life, lamenting bad luck and circumstances, not understanding that the root of their problems lies in their own blind spots. This is the essence of folly. A person allows their worst habits to dictate their decisions, not recognizing their destructive influence and considering this state of affairs normal. They do not control their life but move on inertia, repeatedly repeating the same self-destructive cycles. But here's the truth. Foolishness is not a sentence but a choice. And if these destructive behavior patterns are not recognized and eradicated in time, one can unconsciously continue to make this choice, condemning oneself to repeat mistakes. If you seek to avoid a similar fate or learn to recognize these signs in others, prepare to learn about 6 unmistakable indicators that help identify a person prone to foolishness. Ahead awaits a revelation that may change your perception of human behavior and help you avoid the traps set by your own unawareness. The first sign of a limited mind is an unwavering belief in one's own omniscience. Nothing testifies to intellectual limitation more clearly than a categorical refusal to learn and acquire new knowledge. A person prone to this trait lives under the conviction that they already know all the answers to the questions of existence. They do not bother with critical analysis of their own thinking, do not strive to expand their horizons, and do not admit their mistakes. Instead of developing and improving, they cling to outdated beliefs as if they were an immutable truth. In the Holy Scripture, in the book of Proverbs 18:2, it is wisely noted, "A fool does not delight in understanding, but only in revealing his own mind." The famous psychologist Carl Jung also emphasized that thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. Such an individual easily enters into arguments about subjects in which they are completely incompetent. They reject the advice and guidance of wiser and more experienced people. New ideas and concepts evoke only ridicule and contempt as they contradict their established ideas about the world. Thus, they only exacerbate their own ignorance. Instead of progressing, such people doom themselves to intellectual stagnation. This phenomenon has a real psychological basis, the Dunning-Kruger effect. This cognitive distortion manifests itself in the fact that people with a low level of qualification in a certain area tend to overestimate their abilities, while truly competent specialists recognize the limits of their knowledge. A short-sighted person becomes a victim of this illusion of knowledge. It seems to them that they are an expert, having watched only one video on YouTube. They imagine that they understand economics, politics, and psychology better than professionals. They behave as if their personal, often limited experience is a universal truth. However, in reality, their ignorance is so great that they do not even realize its scale. This way of thinking has a devastating impact on a person's life, leading to a halt in development. Confident in their omniscience, they deprive themselves of the opportunity to improve, which inevitably entails negative consequences. Firstly, such a person repels others. Arrogance, unsupported by knowledge, causes dislike and loss of respect. People lose interest in communicating with someone who considers themselves infallible. Secondly, they make incorrect decisions, not realizing their own mistakes and omissions. This leads to repeating the same costly miscalculations, which negatively affects their life and career. People who refuse to learn are doomed to stay behind, not developing new skills and not adapting to changing conditions. As a result, they get stuck in one place, unable to move forward. A wise person, on the contrary, constantly strives for knowledge. They ask questions, seek mentors, study different points of view, and understand that wisdom comes with continuous learning. As Socrates said, "I know that I know nothing." They surround themselves with people who surpass them in knowledge, actively seek feedback and criticism. He is willing to reconsider his beliefs and update them if necessary. A person who never doubts themselves, doesn't read, doesn't learn, and doesn't admit their mistakes is not intelligent. They are simply stubborn and limited in their development. Another characteristic of a narrow-minded person is their categorical unwillingness to take responsibility for their own actions and their consequences. In their worldview, there is always a carefully prepared excuse to explain any failure or misstep. If they made a wrong decision, then, in their opinion, they were the victim of deception. If they experience failure in any endeavor, then the whole world is to blame, having turned against them. A foolish person never admits their own mistakes, preferring to shift the blame to circumstances. In the event of failure, they blame bad luck, and if they suffer defeat, they blame society, superiors, family, anyone but themselves. Even in the collapse of personal relationships, they tend to blame the opposite sex, unwilling to look at themselves objectively and admit their own shortcomings. Such a person lives in a world of denial because accepting responsibility would mean acknowledging that they are the reason for the lack of progress in their life, which is extremely unpleasant for them. It is worth noting that responsibility is a sign of maturity and developed intellect. A person incapable of admitting their mistakes is doomed to stagnation and lack of personal growth. A foolish person sees themselves only as a victim of circumstances, not as the creator of their own destiny. If they experience financial difficulties, they explain it as the injustice of the system. If they are in poor physical shape, they blame it on bad genetics. If their career is not developing, they are sure that their boss is deliberately hindering their advancement. They stubbornly convince themselves that everything that happens is beyond their control. However, the sad reality is that individuals are willing to resort to the most ridiculous tricks just to avoid confronting the depths of their own souls. This is the essence of the behavior of an unreasonable person, fleeing from themselves. Instead of bravely facing their weaknesses and shortcomings, they erect an impenetrable wall of excuses designed to protect their vulnerable ego. But what happens when a person stubbornly refuses to take responsibility for their actions and decisions? They are doomed to mark time for years, unable to break out of the vicious cycle of the same problems. Those around them gradually lose respect for them as the falsity of their excuses becomes obvious to everyone. Personal growth becomes impossible because accepting responsibility is a necessary condition for development. And most sadly, the person loses control of their own destiny. After all, the harsh truth of life is that by continuing to blame others, they give them power over themselves. The moment a person says, "It's not my fault," they voluntarily give up the opportunity to change their life for the better. Now let's compare the worldview of a fool and a wise person. A fool tends to blame the surrounding world for all their troubles, while a wise person knows how to adapt to any circumstances and find effective solutions. A fool constantly looks for excuses for their failures, while a wise person, on the contrary, strives to find a way out of any, even the most difficult situation. A fool avoids any discomfort, while a wise person accepts it as an inevitable part of the process of growth and self-improvement. That is why unreasonable people often remain poor, embittered, and unhappy, while wise people continue to develop, achieve success, and enjoy life. Therefore, everyone should honestly ask themselves whether they have taken on the burden of full responsibility for their destiny, or whether they are subconsciously trying on the role of a victim of circumstances, because the answer to this question is crucial. Another clear sign of short-sightedness is the inability to control one's emotions. Truly unreasonable people are enslaved by their emotions. They do not think about their actions, but only react to external stimuli, allowing their feelings to guide them, often making rash decisions that they later bitterly regret. Instead of approaching problem-solving with wisdom and composure, they give free rein to their feelings, lose their self-control, or simply run away from difficulties. As an example, consider a person prone to outbursts of anger. They become enraged over the slightest annoyance, be it a traffic jam, a delay in responding to their message, or simply a disagreement with their opinion. They mistakenly believe that this makes them strong, but in reality, it only demonstrates their weakness. Or consider the example of a person who reacts excessively to any event. Every minor problem seems to them like the end of the world. Instead of seeking constructive solutions, he plunges into a vortex of despair and self-pity. A person prone to impulsive actions often acts rashly, recklessly squandering their finances, succumbing to anger and quitting their job, and uttering words they later regret in the heat of arguments. In such situations, they are overwhelmed by emotions that take over their reason. As the renowned Carl Jung warned, the unconscious has tremendous power and can control a person's life if they are not aware of its influence. Men who lack emotional restraint become prisoners of their unconscious reactions, which determine their life path. They do not bother to think and develop strategies, but only blindly react to what is happening. And when something goes wrong, they look for someone to blame for everything but themselves. Such people mistakenly take aggression for a show of strength, believing that a loud cry makes them right. However, in essence, a person who cannot control themselves shows weakness. One who is unable to curb their emotions will always be controlled by others. They are easily manipulated because it is enough to know which buttons to push to subdue them to their will. In addition, they become a puppet of circumstances, losing stability as their mood directly depends on external factors. Ultimately, they fall under the control of their own mind, which sabotages their success, relationships, and opportunities, forcing them to react emotionally rather than logically. In contrast, a person endowed with wisdom exhibits composure in the most stressful circumstances. They are aware of the transient nature of emotions and do not allow them to control their actions. While a fool does not restrain their anger, a wise person knows how to keep it under control. As Proverbs 29:11 states, true strength lies in the ability to control one's feelings. Wise people have the gift of speech and know when to remain silent, maintaining composure even under duress. They resolve disagreements through reason, not by succumbing to outbursts of anger. This is how smart people act. Before reacting, they pause to consider the situation. Instead of acting impulsively, they take the time to analyze their feelings and channel them constructively. Instead of allowing anger to destroy relationships, they use it as a stimulus for self-improvement. Wise people manage their thoughts, practice introspection, recognize when emotions take over, and switch their attention to rational thinking. A person who cannot control their emotions loses control of their life. True strength lies not in a loud cry or a fierce struggle, but in the ability to remain calm, think clearly, and make informed decisions that lead to real success. The fourth characteristic of a fool is their tendency to surround themselves with people who are not particularly intelligent. A person's immediate environment is a kind of calling card, indicating their prospects and aspirations. Take a look at those with whom they prefer to spend time, and you will get a clear idea of their future direction. Often, a fool makes a fatal mistake by cultivating communication with the following categories of people: pessimists, who constantly pour out streams of complaints, look for someone to blame, and see only problems, not solutions. Lazy people who waste precious time on empty entertainment instead of creation. Sycophants who will never dare to criticize their erroneous decisions, but will only nod, pleasing the ear with what they want to hear. And finally, the same lost and aimless individuals as themselves. Instead of seeking wise mentors, such a person prefers to remain in a circle of those who support them in a comfortable comfort zone. It is not for nothing that the great Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once said, "Tell me who your friend is, and I will tell you who you are." A foolish person experiences a panic fear of personal growth and development. They avoid situations that cause discomfort in every possible way. That is why they carefully avoid people who surpass them in mind, discipline, or success. Why? Because communication with such individuals inevitably forces them to face their own shortcomings and weaknesses. A weak person runs from discomfort as from fire, while a strong person, on the contrary, accepts it as an inevitable part of the process of self-improvement. Instead of striving to be the most modest and receptive student in the midst of brilliant minds, a fool prefers to remain the brightest mind in the company of fools. This may flatter their ego, but it ruthlessly cripples their potential for growth and development. The influential psychologist Carl Jung argued that the human subconscious has the ability to absorb the behaviors, thought processes, and energy of the people around them. It follows that spending time with people prone to failure inadvertently leads an individual to adopt their mindset, risking a path to failure themselves. Immersion in a negative atmosphere inevitably leads to the formation of a negative worldview. Associating with people who lack self-discipline risks losing one's own organization and purposefulness. If a person's immediate environment consists of individuals characterized by poverty, laziness, and a lack of life goals, it is easy to predict their future. However, a wise person acts completely differently. They deliberately seek to associate with people who challenge them, stimulate their development, and make them feel uncomfortable, prompting growth. As the saying goes, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Forward-thinking people carefully cultivate their social circle. They strive to surround themselves with mentors, those who have already achieved the desired heights, who can challenge them and push them towards self-improvement. They choose winners, people who are purposeful, disciplined, and ambitious, because they realize a simple truth: the environment has a much greater impact on a person than they tend to believe. A fool allows their environment to control them, while a wise person controls their environment. So the key question is, who makes up a person's social circle? After all, if they find themselves in a society where shallow people prevail, it is quite likely that they share this characteristic. Another trait that distinguishes an unwise person is their pursuit of fleeting pleasures instead of cultivating self-discipline. Such a person becomes a slave to their own, often momentary, desires. They prefer comfort and ease to challenging tasks, entertainment to personal growth. Instead of focusing on creating something truly meaningful, they waste precious time getting cheap dopamine, meaningless entertainment, unhealthy food, endless scrolling through social media, alcohol or drug use, and casual relationships that ultimately leave them emotionally devastated. This is a direct path to self-destruction. The renowned psychologist Carl Jung viewed the human mind as an arena of struggle between the higher and lower selves. When an individual constantly indulges their desires, they allow their lower self, their most primitive and undisciplined instincts, to control their life. Foolish people live for instant gratification, while wise people invest in their future, creating a solid foundation for long-term success and well-being. In other words, a person who cannot restrain their desires inevitably becomes their prisoner, losing control of their own life. In today's world, where instant gratification has become the norm, the path to self-destruction seems easier than ever. Humanity is surrounded by temptations offering quick solutions to any problem. Bored, social media with its endless feed is ready to entertain. Feeling sad, alcohol and drugs offer oblivion. Lonely, dating apps promise instant connections with strangers. Lacking motivation, the virtual worlds of video games allow you to feel successful, avoiding real effort. Day after day, many people choose these cheap sources of dopamine instead of exercising willpower and self-discipline. What is the result? Their dreams remain just dreams, their bodies weaken, their minds become lazy, and, waking up years later, they bitterly realize that they never became who they wanted to be. The fool asks himself, what will give me pleasure right now? The wise man asks himself, what will make my future better? Frivolous people waste time on fleeting pleasures. Forward-thinking people invest it in self-improvement. A lazy person spends days watching TV shows, while a wise person develops skills, trains their body, and strengthens their mind. A weak person spends money on entertainment and unnecessary things, while a wise person saves, invests, and creates wealth, securing their future. An undisciplined person goes from one casual relationship to another, while a wise person builds lasting relationships and chooses a partner who helps them grow. That is why success accompanies only those who possess self-discipline and willpower. Proverbs 21:20 aptly notes that a foolish person squanders all their resources, while a wise person steadily increases their wealth. The history of mankind testifies that outstanding individuals, whether commanders, statesmen, or thinkers, have always been distinguished by high self-discipline. They started their day with early rising, exercised their minds, curbed their passions, and dedicated themselves entirely to achieving their goals. The pursuit of pleasure is a cunning trap that only the short-sighted fall into, while the wise know how to keep their desires under control. For he who is not master of himself will be enslaved by the world around him. One of the most destructive traits of foolishness is the inability to learn from one's own mistakes. Repeating the same blunders is a sure path to self-destruction. A person who stubbornly refuses to learn from their failures becomes a prisoner of their own ignorance. No matter how many opportunities life presents, they will invariably stumble over the same obstacles, whether in personal relationships, in business, or in the pursuit of personal growth. It is worth considering, surely, in everyone's circle, there is someone who repeatedly enters into relationships with the same destructive personalities, wondering why they are constantly hurt, makes rash financial decisions, condemning themselves to a perpetual struggle with monetary difficulties, or wallows in self-destructive habits such as procrastination, laziness, or harmful addictions, without trying to change their approach. This phenomenon, described by Carl Jung as unconscious repetition, is a tendency to reproduce harmful patterns of behavior from the past because they seem familiar and habitual, even despite the suffering they cause. A person devoid of wisdom rarely thinks about the reasons for recurring failures. Instead, they tend to see themselves as a victim of circumstances, blaming the injustice of fate or the actions of others for their troubles. However, it is worth remembering that life is a continuous learning process available to everyone who is willing to perceive its lessons. It is not without reason that they say insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. As Albert Einstein once remarked, life constantly offers us knowledge, but the question is whether we are capable of assimilating it or whether we are doomed to make the same mistakes over and over again. A wise person, on the other hand, approaches their failures from the position of a researcher. Instead of avoiding unpleasant experiences, they carefully analyze their causes. What led to the failure? What actions could have been more effective? What lesson does this situation offer them? It is important to understand that the difference between a fool and a wise person lies not in the absence of mistakes, because both inevitably face setbacks. The key difference is that the fool repeats their mistakes, while the wise person learns valuable lessons from them. The truth is that if a person stubbornly continues to make wrong decisions, life will continue to test them until they finally realize their mistakes and begin to move in the right direction. It is worth pondering whether a person learns from the past or is doomed to repeat old mistakes. As an additional touch to the portrait, it is worth noting that narrow-minded people prefer to talk rather than listen. They revel in the sound of their own voice, striving to dominate conversations, interrupting interlocutors, and rarely showing genuine interest in others' thoughts. Why is the inability to listen a sign of foolishness? The answer is simple. It is through listening that we enrich our minds, build strong connections, open ourselves up to new horizons, and develop as individuals. A person who does not possess the art of listening deprives themselves of the opportunity for growth. Now that 6 key signs that give away a narrow-minded person have been outlined, a logical question arises: how can we avoid falling into these traps? After all, in truth, each of us has, at certain moments in our lives, demonstrated similar patterns of behavior. The main thing is to recognize these manifestations in time and make the necessary adjustments. Wisdom is not bestowed from birth. Intelligence is not a high IQ or encyclopedic knowledge, but rather self-awareness, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, and the discipline to make conscious choices. So how do you break the vicious cycle of ignorance and unlock your true intelligence? Stay with us, because next we will examine in detail the specific steps necessary to overcome these behavioral patterns and reach a qualitatively new level of life. But before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these 6 characteristics have you noticed in others, or perhaps even in yourself? Let's discuss it together. So, if your desire is to break free from the shackles of ignorance and cultivate true intelligence, here is what you need to do. First of all, show extreme honesty towards yourself. It's time to stop deceiving yourself. Face reality and ask yourself the following questions. In what situations do I repeatedly make the same mistakes? Am I inclined to blame others instead of taking responsibility for my actions? Am I surrounding myself with people who contribute to my growth or those who hold me back, condemning me to stagnation? As Carl Jung once noted, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. If you're unwilling to honestly confront your shortcomings, personal growth will be impossible. Secondly, it's essential to curb your ego and cultivate humility. Avoid emulating the ignorant person convinced of their own omniscience. True wisdom lies in recognizing the continuous nature of learning. You should question your own beliefs, asking yourself if they might be wrong and whether you can learn from others. Be open to feedback and avoid defensiveness when faced with criticism. Ceasing to learn is equivalent to halting your development. Therefore, maintain humility, curiosity, and avoid self-assurance. Thirdly, it's important to master the art of emotional self-control. A foolish person becomes a puppet of their own emotions, such as anger, envy, and impulsiveness. A wise person, on the other hand, manages their feelings and contemplates their actions. Develop patience, learn to listen rather than react impulsively, and don't allow trivial matters to upset you. A person who cannot control themselves will inevitably be controlled by external circumstances. Fourthly, surround yourself with people who are intellectually superior. If you're the smartest person in your circle, it indicates the narrowness of your social sphere. Seek out mentors, eliminate negative influences, and learn from those who have achieved more in life. As Jim Rohn once said, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Therefore, choose your company carefully. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, learn from every mistake you make. Mistakes are inevitable on everyone's life journey. The key question is whether you can extract valuable lessons from your errors, analyze the situation, adapt to new circumstances, and develop as a person, or whether you'll continue to repeat the same mistakes over and over. A wise person perceives each failure as a valuable lesson from which to gain useful knowledge. At the same time, a short-sighted person neglects the opportunity to learn and continues to fall into the same traps. Intelligence is a conscious choice. Stupidity is not an immutable state unless you choose to remain in it. Everyone has the potential for change, but it requires considerable effort. Honestly, examine yourself, maintain humility, and learn from your mistakes. Surround yourself with the right people who will support and motivate you to grow. Most people, unfortunately, do not follow these principles. They continue to be trapped in their habitual patterns of behavior, blame others, avoid responsibility, and wonder why their lives don't improve. But there are those who strive for growth and development. These people are unwilling to remain average. They aspire to be those who learn, adapt, and succeed. These are the people who can change their lives and reach new heights. So now the decisive role passes to you, and the outcome is in your hands.